to all decks. Time for our wrap up of the animated series on Enterprise Incidents with Scott and Steve. I'm Scott Mance.
And I'm Steve Morris, and I cannot believe we're here, that we've arrived at this place. It's kind of amazing to me.
It is amazing because for the second time we are doing a wrap up of a series, but this is a wrap up that ties together everything. It ties together the entire, I would say, first generation of Star Trek, starting with the cage going through to the counterclock incident, and really brings a close to a phase of Star Trek that would never be seen again in exactly this kind of way, whether it was in live action or animated. And that's something that I never realized when we even decided, hey, yeah, let's do the animated series, that I would have this feeling.
It's funny. I hadn't thought about it in quite the way you said, but I think there is a fundamental difference now that you say that between everything that's come up to this point and the motion picture and everything that comes after, even if we just stick with the original crew. And I'll tell you what one of the biggest differences. The biggest difference, and this is going to sound really weird what I'm about to say, is I think on some level the biggest difference is lower stakes because the motion picture was so expensive. There's so much money and so much pressure going on it. And the same in a way, even though Wrath of Khan was much cheaper than the motion picture, there's still this huge pressure of we have to get this right. Whereas Star Trek is the original series is a TV show that was under a lot of budget constraints, and they're in a rush to get episodes done because, you have to get an episode out a week, 27 episodes in a season. That's a ton. And then the animated series expectations were way, way lower. And the funny thing about that is, even though obviously I love, the movies that I love, and there's incredible things that happen in the movies, is there's actually stuff you get to do when expectations are lower that you can't get away with when the entire studio is looking at the millions of dollars you're spending on a movie. That's just different.
That is a great way to put it. And certainly the way that Star Trek went back and forth in the mid to late 70s with, are we going to do a movie? Are we going to do a TV movie? Are we going to do another series, which came really, 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 really close to happening, phase two. The way it just sort of like went back and forth, there was so much going on. A book a couple of books have already been written about this period of time, even though we really didn't see any product until December 7th, 1979 with the motion picture. But I think it's because of that the animated series gets overlooked. Certainly I have to admit, I overlooked it. Like when as much as you and I especially truly love the original series, it's the animated series is just not a show that I would frequently go back to, except for maybe a couple of episodes. One of them, of course, being Yesteryear. But I am as guilty as the next Trekker for unfairly overlooking and underappreciating the animated series. And the early 70s, this was really a time. I mean, it's a really, really fascinating time for Star Trek when people like you and me, the syndication generation, really made Star Trek popular. And then here's this animated series to give us new adventures. I mean, it's not live action, but we'll take it. And I just have a whole new appreciation for this. And to be able to do an episode by episode deep dive of the animated series during the year in which the animated series is marking its 50th anniversary, and during a period of time where I think, and I certainly hope, that more people go back and rediscover the animated series, and then listen to our episodes on Enterprise Incidents one by one and go, hey, these guys are pretty good. What else have they done? Holy moly, they did the original series too. I gotta catch up on Enterprise Incidents. That's my dream.
I want your dream to come true, and I think it will. I mean, I am very confident in the work that we have done both on the original series and on the animated series. And in particular, I have to say and I just wanted to say this right at the beginning. I would say the one of the biggest changes with doing the animated series with you, it's not that we didn't have great guests when we did the original series. We had fantastic guests, all of which brought in by you, by the way. And of course, the biggest and most important being having Ralph Sinensky along for all the
Ralph.
episodes we did. One of the greatest experiences ever in terms of certainly podcasting for me and conversations for me and Star Trek for me. But Man, with as we did the animated series, we had so many guests that you brought in, like Bob Klein, like, people that we had the writers of the shows, we had Alan Dean Foster, we had people that were really around, and I felt so connected to this moment in time that I think has really been in the shadows of Star Trek, and it was because of getting to talk to these fantastic people every week.
I gotta say, part of looking back when we were doing the original series, I wish I had really thought of this sooner about reaching out to some of the original series cast members who are still with us. Like Barbara Luna from Mirror Mirror, like Sean Kenny, who played not only DePaul in Arena and A Taste of Armageddon, but also the Deliberated Pike in the Menagerie Raps. I wish I thought of that sooner,
Right.
but really kind of started with Ralph Sinensky when he joined us for This Side of Paradise. That I went, wait a minute, and that sort of got the ball rolling a little. But I agree with you that having so many guests associated with the animated series, uh, I mean, really, just thinking about it right now, talking with you, Steve, just makes me go, wow, we really did something special for a
Yeah.
series that deserved to be taken seriously and deserve to have this kind of analysis. I know just from my research and from other sort of podcasts that I've been exposed to, and certainly when I was like looking around on the podcast world to see like how many people really did like a rewatch of the animated series or even a write up of the animated series episode by episode, and there's really not a lot of them. So to have like William Simpson, who voiced young Spock, or certainly Fred Bronson, who really, brought us out on a big note, really stuck the
Yeah.
landing with us for the animated series. But also, I mean, Bob Klein being at his house and doing that interview, like,
Mhm.
Steve, this was like really, really cool.
No, it was a definite treat, and it was also so cool how much love there was for Star Trek in all those people we talked to. Most of them were huge Star Trek fans when they started to work on the animated series, and how much insight there was into this weird moment after Star Trek had died before it had been reborn,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that's kind of what the animated's like, is this gonna continue? Are we gonna and I think it was really, really interesting to go down that road.
And again, just that early 70s period where people were watching the original show on 5 nights a week and really making it popular, and then Paramount said, "Whoa, we got something really good here. What did we do? Did we screw the pooch by, canceling the show in '69?" And then, of course, you got the conventions which were coming up, and this is fandom at the time before, Star Wars really came around. And then, of course, you have just, this talk like, should we bring it back? Well, they did, and the show was called
Yep.
Star Trek. I mean, now we're calling it Star Trek, the original series, and we're calling it Star Trek, the animated series. And then you've got Next Generation, DS9, and so on and so on. But those first two shows take away sort of the disclaimer. They are both just called Star Trek, and they belong together. And to really bookend both shows with, our first look at the cage to our final look at Counterclock Incident really just makes it all feel like one complete series where the animated series is the fourth season we never got.
Right, right. Well, let's talk about it. I think one of the big discoveries was how many contributions the animated series made to Star Trek in general. And what are some of the big ones that you can think of that we wouldn't have if we didn't have the animated series?
Well, for one thing, the fact that you had the the same actors voicing their characters, obviously, except Walter Koenig. The fact that you had Gene Roddenberry involved in that first season, Dorothy Fontana very, very, very involved in that first season. I mean, you couldn't have asked for a better original series veteran to sort of spearhead and oversee the whole project than Dorothy Fontana, because she wrote just some of the very best episodes. But in terms of what came after the animated series, obviously one of the first things that comes to mind is Kirk's middle name, Tiberius.
Yep.
Even though we heard it in the animated series, we didn't hear it again. We heard it in Bem. From David Gerald, who wrote that, but we didn't hear his name again until Star Trek Six: The Undiscovered Country. But hey, you know what? That's a big movie. It's a great movie. And the
Yeah.
name Tiberius is right there. And it's like, well, we got that from the animated series. I guess that makes it canon. What about you? What do you think?
Well, I'll tell you the most interesting one to me, and we kind of talked about this a little bit as we went, but all of the Star Trek shows after this were ensemble shows. And I think the hints of that really starts in the animated series because it isn't the Kirk show or the Kirk and Spock show. There are definitely episodes where all the supporting characters, particularly Sulu and Uhura, really come and emerge as really big players. And I think that points the direction that Star Trek is going to go in the future.
Absolutely agree with you. I hadn't thought about it in quite that way, but if you look at the ratio of original episodes that really felt like ensembles and the ratio of animated episodes that felt like ensembles, you're absolutely right. The animated series ratio is much, much, much higher. And whether it was deliberate or subconscious or just a coincidence, absolutely moving forward, every other Star Trek series from Next Gen all the way through to certainly Strange New Worlds, very, very, very much an ensemble series, and I think that's a positive. That's a very a big plus that came out of maybe the seeds that were planted with the animated show. But of course,
I think I sorry, just jump in. I think it is a mixed bag, frankly, because like the in terms of it being ensemble shows, is that yes, it's absolutely fantastic. And I think Strange New Worlds right now in particular is handling those ensemble elements really, really well.
yeah,
But man, particularly in Next Gen, or all of the other ones, there are a lot of episodes where it's like, really, are we going to go spend this much time with Alexander and Worf, and are we going to like, I don't care. I want to go on an adventure with Picard and Data. Like, I don't need to do service to each one of these characters and whatever's going on in their lives all the time. Like that's some of the weaker episodes of later series is when we're just like, let's service the ensemble.
This is why I think you and I are really sharing the same brain here because I've been doing my rewatch, because I've been posting about it on social media of Next
Yeah,
Generation. So Steve, I just rewatched a fistful of Datas.
right.
And I mean, I think it's a great showcase for Brent Spiner. He's clearly having a ball. But I'm
Totally.
with you. I'm like, I don't really need to see Alexander.
Yeah.
I'm with
Yeah.
you, buddy. I agree completely. But I do think certainly in the case of season 3 of Picard and Strange New Worlds, I've really, really been enjoying the chemistry of the cast members in particular with Strange New Worlds is really what's making that ensemble just work so well. Of course, we have to mention Robert April, and we discussed all of this with our guest Fred Bronson. But not only does Robert April sort of save the day, well, not sort of, he does save the day in the counterclock incident, but we see him in the flesh
Yeah.
in Strange New Worlds, and I think that's really cool. And I think it's also a way to sort of tie back, Roddenberry's original vision, original idea for a captain when he was actually named Robert April. But that's another biggie that we had that.
I think another one is, and we mentioned it again in our last episode, the counterclock incident, is were so much freer at referencing other episodes and Star Trek history in this than they were in the original series. And I was thinking about it since we recorded Counterclock and going, I wonder if part of that might come from Marvel Comics. Because if you read, that's what one of the big things of the Marvel revolution of the 60s was really, really building on continuity and the characters and stuff like that over a long period of time. And you see that start to come in the animated series. And of course, that is a huge part of Star Trek going forward is exist in a universe with history and with events that we can reference in later episodes and build upon.
When we were doing the original series and you had an episode like By Any Other Name, where Rojan says, "Oh, there's an energy barrier at the edge of your galaxy." And Kirk says, "Yes, I know, we've been there." That was such a morsel of continuity that we hardly ever really got in the original show in an overt way, until Steve, you and I came along and really looked into all of that and made a whole lot of sense of tying all the connecting all the dots with the original show. But you're absolutely right, and bringing up the counterclock incident is a great example. You got the Beta Niobe Nova from all our yesterdays. You got the mention of Minara from the Empath. You've got Capella 4, the Flower from Friday's Child. You're right. The animated series really did lean more heavily into the chronology established by the original show, and that's another reason why this should absolutely be seen as one whole complete series, not the original series and the animated series. And also moving forward, the lower decks, which I adore the series. I mean, it's goofy and it's fun, and but in the end, it's very much Star Trek, and I love the characters. But Mike McMahon, who's the showrunner and executive producer of Lower Decks, loves the animated series, and he is leaned into so much of the animated series, like really seeing the entire animated series as canon, to where, I forgot to mention this when we did the Infinite Vulcan and you have Giant Spock. There's an episode in the Lower Decks from the second season called Kayshawn, His Eyes Open, where you see sort of a grisly fate to the giant Spock. He, is a skeleton wearing, the blue shirt. It's clearly giant Spock. And I went, oh, poor giant Spock. But, like and again, there's so much, Roddenberry back in the 70s, like, yeah, kind of dismissed the animated series. It's not really canon except for yesteryear. But, if he were with us today, I think he would sort of hopefully revise that statement and go, you know what? Yeah, absolutely. It's canon.
In what ways do you think Star Trek the animated series is Star Trek? Like, what were the biggest things that sold you on the fact that this is real Star Trek?
Well, I just remember when I first got into Star Trek and I was discovering the original series and kind of the animated series around the same time, because it was still on Saturday mornings.
Sure.
It was all just called Star Trek. And if I'm watching on WPHL channel 17 and I'm watching, like, Mirror Mirror, and then, Doomsday Machine, and, Metamorphosis and Tribbles and all that, seeing the actors and all that, and recording the episodes with my little tape recorder, and then I flip over Saturday mornings at 10:30, and there's William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy doing the voices and everything. You still have like the sound effects from the bridge and the transporter and the phasers and all that. And I'm recording it with my little tape recorder. It's all Star Trek. So, having certainly the actors and Roddenberry and Fontana as producers, and all those writers from the original series like David Gerald and Samuel Peoples, Stephen Kandel, Margaret Arman, and Mark Daniels, who directed 14 episodes of the original series, writing an episode of animated series. I mean, close your eyes. It's Star Trek.
I mean, for me, the big thing, and it was the thing that had gotten lost in some of the really crappy episodes in the third season of the original series, is to me, it was the characters. Is that the characters were recognizably behaving the way they were supposed to for most of the episodes of the animated series. There's obviously some that they don't, but I really felt like in addition to being obviously the voices of the actors, it was also like, yes, that is how Scotty behaves. That is how the Spock McCoy relationship works. That is the characters that I love. And that, I think, is the biggest thing that they got right. And I also will say, here's the thing that I think they got wrong, or that doesn't make it feel like Star Trek, and that's polish. Is that it's attention to detail. It's all of those things that you heard me complain about as we went through it. It's music cues and really crappy animation, story elements that just made no sense whatsoever, really kind of dropping the ball on the science fiction. And it's not, you know, they had the budget they had the limitations they had, that did the best they can, but I don't find the best they can acceptable in terms of Star Trek being a great show, and so those elements that elevated it from good to great are mostly, in my opinion, missing from the animated series.
Yeah, I agree on both counts. I mean, certainly when it comes to the relationships with the characters, certainly when it comes to the Spock McCoy, sort of the digging at each other and the humor that came with that, they got that right. When you look at an episode like One of Our Planets is Missing, the burden of command on Kirk, they carried that right over from Balance of Terror into the animated series, and that's a great way in which. It felt like Star Trek. And then you've got compassion, the compassion that we've seen Kirk display in some of those really great first season episodes. Moments like at the end of Charlie X, at the end
Mm.
of Arena, where certainly at the end of Balance of Terror, where you see empathy and compassion for an adversary. Look at Magic's Omegas 2, is this guy the devil? And then Kirk is defending him at the end, and also defending humanity, which is on trial. That was absolutely positively a feel for Star Trek. And I think the only area where you and I disagree, and I don't mean disagree in a big D word disagree, but But I agree with your point about the faults of the animated series. There are moments where you could just see them like, okay, let's wrap this up, or where like the logic doesn't make any sense whatsoever. There is no logic at all. It felt very rushed, but it is also because the animated show was part of a greater machine that was being processed at Filmation. That I went, oh well, yeah, okay. They had their hands full, and they just let things fell through the cracks. But the problem is that I noticed, like you did, when they fell through the cracks.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's when you're making a piece of art, and it's so funny. I think we all walk around with our curves that we grade on, as we discussed, and everyone's curve is a little bit different. And how much do you take that into consideration?
Yep, for sure.
So, Scott, I'm very curious because of a conversation we had right before we started recording. But who would you say is the most surprising character that emerged in the animated series?
Without question, this is like a really, really easy answer, and I feel like it's also the most obvious one, and that is Lieutenant Uhura.
All right, we do agree because you said it's so obvious right before we recorded, and I'm like, is it going to be obvious? But yes, we 100% agree that is the most surprising character
I
of the
mean,
main
that
cast.
episode, the Lorelei Signal, which starts off as for the most part, a run of the mill animated episode, fine, but not spectacular until that moment, that empowering moment when she says, Uhura says, I'm taking command of the Enterprise. And from that point on, it just turns like, whoa, my God, this is so great. I wish this was actually a live action episode. And again, that was the first of two times that she actually took command. The second time was without the fanfare. But that episode, you can just hear in Nichelle Nichols' voice, she's just going, about friggin' time. This is Uhura's moment, and I'm going to make the most of this. That episode is certainly one of the animated episodes that makes me go like, this is why the show needs to be taken as seriously and appreciated as much as the original series.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that episode actually sums up kind of what we were talking about a moment ago, which is for that moment, 100%. It is super important. It is super dramatic. It's great for the characters. It's great for for all the women and African American women that were watching the show. It's great for all those reasons. It's not a very good episode of Star Trek, you know. And
Yeah,
so that's sort of the complexity of the animated series. Is there can be things that are really important that are part of canon that are really cool, even though the show isn't really firing on all cylinders throughout the whole thing.
but you know what, Steve? That just hearing you say that right now just makes me think of like when we did our deep dive on Plato's Stepchildren with Dan
Exactly.
Madsen. Like, definitely not a not a great episode by any stretch. It's hard to watch for a long stretch of time. But our guest was so great, such a great conversation, and there are moments within the episode that are quintessentially Star Trek,
Right.
and certainly great moments for our characters. Like when Kirk says to Alexander, where I come from, none of this matters and nobody has the power. It's such a great moment in otherwise like mediocre episode. So yeah, I'm with you on that. So Steve, in terms of just like the most surprising character of the main cast, who would you say was the most underutilized member of the main cast?
Well, let me give you two answers to that question. The first answer, and really the most important one, is Chekhov is the most underutilized member of the main cast because he doesn't appear and his absence is so keenly felt by me. We had all these conversations about how Leonard Nimoy fought to get Sulu and Uhura on, and it's like, what about Chekhov?
Yeah.
It's really weird he's not there. So that is my first answer. Would you like my second answer? Yeah,
I absolutely can't wait to hear what your second answer is. You have me at the edge of my seat.
my second answer is a guy known as James Tiberius Kirk.
Not what I was expecting here to hear you say, but let's hear it.
This is the flip side of the card that I said before about this being the beginning of using Star Trek as an ensemble. I don't think there's a lot of, I mean, like Kirk's in it, but Kirk is the lead of the original series, and he is the captain of the animated series. And so, yeah, there are Kirk moments, but like, I'm used to every week coming in and spending some time with the greatest captain in the history of Starfleet. And he's there, but he's not nearly there as much. And there aren't, I mean, I can't point to a great Kirk speech. I can't point to a great emotional Kirk moment, really. Like, that's just, he's there, but he
Yeah,
is not the Jim Kirk of the original series.
I agree with you. I do agree with that assessment. I think the only time that's coming to my mind right now that we had sort of like that Kirk moment at the end of the episode is at the end of How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth,
Totally.
when he's basically giving the same speech to Kukulkan that he gave to Apollo at the end of Who Mourns for Adonais.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, you don't have like that risk is our business. In every revolution, there's one man with a vision. We can admit that we're killers, but we're not going to kill today. That's all it takes. I agree with
And
you.
and you don't have the action ones either. You don't have him fighting 3, drill thralls in, Gamesters of Triskelion. You don't have, you don't have the him being the person who's physically saving the day as much, and you don't have him emotionally or intellectually saving the day as much.
The other one that's coming to mind is also, an episode that I certainly voiced my appreciation for many times, The Magics of Megas 2, where Kirk has to defend Lucian, who may be Lucifer, and also the human race. That's a quintessential Kirk moment too. But it doesn't rise to the level of everything you pointed out. Would you like to hear my most underutilized
Absolutely.
character? Okay, this is not. You're not going to guess this. And honestly, Steve, it's debatable whether or not this character can be considered a main character. But since this main character was introduced in the animated series, taking advantage of animation to do something they probably wouldn't have been able to
Mm,
do as well in the original series, I would love to have seen more of Lieutenant Maress.
totally.
Okay. I mean, she's Uhura's backup in communications. And certainly, this is an alien presence on the bridge. Next to Arix, the only other alien presence we saw in this phase next to Spock. And it would have been kind of cool to learn more about Maress and her background. And we hear a little bit about it, but, really make her like a main character. But I do love that she's treated just like everybody else because she's a Starfleet officer and she's on the bridge of the Enterprise.
I think it's a great point. I think she was totally underutilized because unlike Eric's, I actually never found Eric's particularly interesting. Like he doesn't have much of a character,
Right.
in terms of a personality that was really interesting. Whereas Maress did have little hints, that her species or her culture comes from a different place. And yeah, I think there were all sorts of cool things we could have done with her.
Absolutely. Well, in terms of like the guests we've had, we talked a bit about this already, but like, I mean, for just 22 episodes, we've had some pretty great guests. It's really hard to pick the best one. Maybe you have best ones. Who comes to mind top on your list?
Well, I was kind of thinking of who I'd like to see more of, and the first one is Ensign Walking Bear from How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. I think it's been really rare that we brought in a new crew member and had them play such a central part in the story. I mean, there's like Marla McGivers, there's a few others, there's Helen Noel, and those, so mostly like love interests and but having a character who just like, oh, this guy comes from a different culture, has a different set of experiences, knows a whole bunch of different stuff. I think he was an interesting character to have on our bridge crew.
That was a great addition. And second to the last episode, of course, the How Sharper Than the Serpent's Tooth, the episode that won Star Trek an Emmy, a big Emmy, which is extremely cool. When it comes to characters I'd like to see again, I kind of went with some of the antagonists.
Mm.
Looking at one of those, like who would have been like a character that you'd like to see pop up maybe a couple times, like Harry Mudd.
Hmm.
So I'm going again back to the Magics of Megas 2. It's like we never really knew by the end of the episode whether or not Lucian actually was Lucifer, the devil. It was alluded to. Certainly, you could watch the episode and just be like, oh, yeah, that guy's the devil. Certainly looks like, this image that we've had in our minds is the devil. But what if he showed up in a live action episode? What if the Enterprise went back for, let's say, second contact, the term they use all the time on lower decks. What if they went back to check up on how the Valians are doing in Gamma
Mm,
Trianguli 6 from the
mm,
Apple? What if
mm,
they went back to see, oh, how they getting along? How they doing on their own without Val taking care of them? What if they went back there and they were being ruled by Lucian? And
mm.
Kirk has to, in his diplomatic fashion and in a way that does not interfere with the Prime Directive, try to, get the Valiants back on their own way without the influence of a character who may or may not be the devil. I kind of thought that went through.
Look, there's all sorts of I think that's great, and there's all sorts of place that fits into Star Trek ideals. Like in a weird way, I'm going thinking about like Wolf in the Fold and things where we've encountered evil and stuff like that. And Lucian would fit right into those sort of things. You know, a character I would like to see
Yeah.
again, and I even kind of almost go, maybe this is possible that we will see this character again because we've already seen Robert April in Strange New Worlds. And I went, you know, who I was really interested in is Sarah April. Like, we hear all this stuff about she was the first medical officer on the Enterprise. She invented all this stuff. She figured out, she like defined what a Star Trek medical officer is going to be. I think that must be a pretty cool person.
I That's a really, really great point. And that relationship between Robert and Sarah at the end of certainly at the end of the counterclock incident, but this is a really interesting character. Like, what if Robert April was off, being a Commodore, ambassador at large, and we saw Sarah April in another situation completely. That's a really, really great idea. And just again for a 23-minute episode, I thought that relationship in these characters,
Mhm.
Robert and Sarah April, were written out really, really well. So hats off to Fred Bronson for that.
So we've already talked about your love of Lucian. Are there other villains or antagonists that you really liked in this season of the animated series?
I think that Kukulkan Khan was a really interesting, uh, I would say, antagonist. I wouldn't call him really a villain. Uh, and even though it's very much like, okay, it's like, wants to be worshipped like Apollo, and we got a little bit of that background, all the stuff with the Mayan culture. I thought that was really interesting. I wish that that we could have seen more of that. Certainly if this was a longer episode, if they could have figured out how to do it as a live action episode, I don't know how they could have done that. But I just was really fascinated by
Mm.
the character of Kukulkan, and I could see why that episode certainly deserves to have been the one to win Star Trek its Emmy Award. What about you?
So I have several. One, I don't particularly love the episode, but I like the idea of the character, and that is Carter Winston from The Survivor,
Oh,
because I like the idea of like you were a human and then you got transformed and you're disconnected from your humanity, or what is it that makes you human, and can you still be the person you were? Those are all really interesting Star Trek ideas that I like a lot. I think T'Char from the Jihad, who's the winged warrior, also again, it's one with an internal struggle, of do I move forward in this peaceful way or can I go back with my instincts of the kind of warrior I really want to be? And the other one, I don't want to ever want to see this guy again, but there is no character who irritated me more in the animated series and maybe in a lot of Star Trek than Bem. Man, I hate that guy. So
yeah.
I
Oh,
certainly had a
absolutely.
strong emotional reaction to him.
But also Ben, uh, the alien sort of intelligence that was guiding the native race to intelligence. I never noticed that before in the episode. Of course, it's been I would say good couple of decades since I'd
Right.
seen it, but that was I don't know, Steve, to have an animated episode of Star Trek make you think of the monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Not bad for a Saturday morning cartoon series.
Yeah.
What about the episode that surprised you the most? Not the one that you love the most, but the one that surprised you the most. And why did it surprise you?
It's funny. It is actually what we were both just talking about, and that's Bem. And again, is it a perfect episode? Does it all fit together? No. Do I hate that character? Yes, I do. But it's what you said. It's your thoughts about 2001, which was really great, and that's what made me connect to the idea that, oh, Star Trek is a polytheistic universe where there are all sorts of minor gods on different planets in different cultures with different powers and different goals, leading their, their people in some different way. And I was like, oh, Ben helped me connect and helped you connect all sorts of different Star Trek ideas together, despite the fact I don't particularly love the episode, but I thought it was a really surprising one.
Yeah, there's things I love about it and things I don't like, and you've definitely touched on what I don't like about Ben, which is them.
Yeah.
But in terms of most surprising episode, I was really surprised by how well the slaver weapon worked
Hmm.
without the Enterprise and without even a mention of Captain Kirk. And that it's Spock and Sulu and Uhura. I think that would have made a really interesting live action episode. Again, maybe the aliens would have benefited better, certainly as they did in the animated series than in the live action. But I was surprised by just how well it worked on its own. Without without Kirk at all, but also as a companion episode to the Galileo 7 as
Hmm.
an examination of Spock in command, where he, just like with the Galileo 7, made a couple of mistakes here and there based on his approach of command from logic. So that was the episode that kind of surprised me the most.
I totally get it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We talked about this when we did the original series, is we looked for best moments of our characters, and frankly, this whole conversation, I would say for me, is harder than it was when we did the original series because the fact is, I knew the original series backwards and forwards. Even the episodes I didn't like, I knew really, really, really well.
Sure.
That is not true of the animated series. I've watched them a few times. I watched them for the show. I have not memorized them in any way, but I will ask you, do you have a favorite moment for Mr. Sulu?
I thought the stuff with Sulu, and even though I don't care for the episode, the Practical Joker, the
Mm,
stuff with Sulu and the holodeck, a portion of the episode, I thought that was a lot of fun.
mhm.
Um, yeah, I think that kind of does it. Again, I think that when it comes to empowering moments that we remember from the original show, I think those moments are not as prominent in the animated show, even
Yeah.
though I love the animated show.
For me, it's the one you just mentioned. It's the slaver weapon because that's where Sulu and his expertise on armory and weapons, and he actually is telling Spock what to do because he is an expert in one area. So that would be the one for Sulu for me.
There you go.
My guess is Uhura, we're going to have the same one.
Yeah, Uhura, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's one and only one, and that's it.
It is the Lorelei signal.
Yes.
It'd be really funny, by the way, if you said, "What? No, it's not that. Are you crazy?" Um, you know what? I could tell you one for Scotty, but I don't think Scotty shines in the animated series. I really struggled. I said one of our planets is missing because he's teching some tech stuff, but I don't know. What do you got for Scotty?
You know what? I really only had one standout moment, one that really stood out for me as a truly great moment for the original series crew, and that was Uhura from the Lorelei Signal.
Yeah.
I can't think of like anything, and this goes back to your point about Kirk and not having like those big Kirk moments at the end of the episode or whatever. But yeah, I kind of just like when I was like trying to think about it, the only one that I really thought was worthy of like mentioning for this part of the conversation was Uhura.
I'll tell you my other ones because I agree. Well, and this is why, you know, you love the animated series, and that's great. I wouldn't say that I love it in other than the fact that I love Star Trek, but like it doesn't have those highs. It's really
Yeah.
hard to find. Like for McCoy, him in Albatross, where he's concerned that he might have caused the death of many, many, people because of this plague. It's pretty interesting. Spock has an entire episode of yesteryear, and so obviously that's where he shines the most. And the only one I came up with for Kirk is in the ambergris element where he's going, I can't captain the starship from an aquarium, that inside a tank. Like that, I could feel Shatner's passion as he's delivering the line. Are these great moments? No,
Right.
they're not great moments. They're moments.
I agree completely. Like, are there any moments that truly moved you in the animated series? And you brought up something that just now that is really the one that, but I'm curious to see if you
I
have
mean,
the same pick.
frankly, the only emotional episode for me is yesteryear.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, the moment where young Spock has to decide to euthanize his pet is just so emotional, and just like the goodbye between Spock and Sarek, old Spock, at the end of that episode, where it's almost like Sarek kind of knows who he is. I thought that was just the Citizen Kane, that episode yesteryear. It's the Citizen Kane of the animated series.
I don't know, Scott. I mean, I guess if all things have to have their own Citizen Kane, that is certainly it. And it
Yeah.
is a flashback episode, which is Citizen Kane is a story of flashbacks. But I don't know. I mean, well, we'll get to it a little further. So, are there any themes that emerged in the animated series that were unique or different from things that had already been Star Trek themes in the original series?
Well, I think the theme, yeah, again, bringing up the slaver weapon, this weapon. I mean, you're talking about the early '70s, with the Cold War, and absolute power, and that's something that held up in the early '70s. Certainly was relevant then, and it's obviously very, very relevant now. Also, in Beyond the Farthest Star, artificial intelligence, that is even more relevant today for a whole slew of reasons. That's a whole other conversation that I'm sure you and I could talk for hours about. But yeah, those are kind of episodes where even though I thought overall the animated series like had mature and provocative episodes, I think those are themes that were relevant then, relevant now. What about you?
Well, the first one is one I already mentioned, which is the idea of these super powerful creatures that are almost like gods. Whether it's one of our planets is missing or whatever's being, held and beyond the farthest star. Obviously you brought up Lucian and the Magics of Magus 2. There's I forget the name of the species, but the species that sort of sets everything up in the Jihad is
Hmm.
also sort of like a overpowerful one. And of course in Bem, and so like that idea of like multiple different powerful gods. And the other one that comes up a lot is, because it's the animated series, is yeah, we can shrink them or make them sick or make them swim underwater or make, like we get to change, or they all get younger. Like those are things that we were able to play with in the animated series that we didn't play with in the original series.
And I love those moments, like, if you're looking back to the deadly years where the crew gets older, and then you're looking at the counterclock incident where the crew gets younger, or they shrink. I think that's really fun to see how resourceful they get, in
Mhm.
terms of being able to maintain control of the Enterprise, as they physically and then mentally change. When you were prepping for each and every episode of Enterprise Incidents, and you were watching these episodes, sometimes I'm guessing for the first time, if not in decades, but maybe even ever, what episode kind of improved during your rewatch?
Well, again, it's harder to answer than this would have been in the original series because it's not like I had an expectation. I didn't really remember a lot of these episodes as much. But the big one for me was the ambergris element. Is like that one had a lot of different interesting ideas. As I already said, Shatner kind of shines in his performance. And we had a lot of stuff going on and a real build towards sort of an adventurous end. And we also had Star Trek ideas in terms of the next generation and moving on from new ideas and things like that. I think was all pretty interesting. How about you?
Well, there are a couple. For one, I think that one of our planets is missing is one that I was really, really went way up because of just how much they were able to put into a 24-minute episode. And you have someone like Bob Wesley, who obviously Kirk knew from The Ultimate Computer. The Time Trap is one that I really, really enjoyed a lot. I think it's just a super solid, very entertaining, well paced episode that's exciting from start to finish. Of course, there's a lot of Star Trek Easter eggs with all the different alien races on the council when they're in the trap. But I think the one that really improved the most, and just because I was able to see it with a different set of eyes in terms of tying everything together, was the counterclock incident. For reasons
Mm.
I already talked about, whether it's like Robert April from Roddenberry's original pitch to just all the different ways the episode tied into episodes from the original series. But also, I forgot about the ageism aspect that was brought to the fore with Commodore April being forced to retire at 75. I mean, ageism is something that obviously still very much prevalent in the world today, especially the entertainment industry, and also just the heart of that and just bringing that episode to a close with a line about a second life that they were able to have, and a second life that Star Trek was able to have because of the animated series.
Right. Was there an episode that went down in your estimation that was disappointing on the rewatch?
Absolutely, this is an easy one. I think this is the only episode that I really don't like from the animated series, even though it features the holodeck. But the Practical Joker to me just felt silly. It felt like an episode that was deliberately written for the Saturday morning crowd. It did not have really any depth that might have been there if it was like a comedy episode of the original series, like a piece of the action or Trouble with Tribbles. But that's the one that went down in my estimation. What about you?
All right, I'm going to give you the craziest answer you could possibly have imagined.
Uh
But
oh.
when we're talking about what went down in your estimation, what we're talking about is expectations versus how it was when you watched it. And my answer for what went down the most in my estimation is, spoiler alert, also my answer for the number one episode of the animated series, period. And that is Yesteryear.
Oh my goodness! I got to hear this.
So it's great. I mean, it is that's what I say. It is the best episode of the animated series, but it's also the one I remembered the most. It's also the one where in my head was like, there is one great episode of the animated series that's worthy of the original series. It's going to be amazing. And it's really, really good. And I think the thing that people remember from it is all of the incredible story things, all the character development for Spock. And watching it, I was like, yeah, this is good, but it wasn't. I didn't have that huge emotional response I wanted to have. What I really wanted was, I was like, man, this is great. I would love to see this story expanded and done with more resources and with more stuff. And so this is not a criticism of the episode, but if the question is what went down in my estimation, my memory of Yesteryear was put it up with the great episodes of Star Trek, and I can't quite put it up quite that high at this point.
I still do put it up there. I get why you don't.
Totally.
Uh, I
Totally get
I
it.
I still do. I think certainly having William Simpson, who voiced young Spock, join us for the conversation of that episode. And by the way, joined us at your home, and we did it in
Yeah.
person. Was really one of my favorite conversations I think we had in all of Enterprise Incidents.
Yeah.
It was this, really, really super nice guy, great stories. Really brought a lot to the conversation. But it's thinking of it as the episode more than any other that I think would have just made like a damn fine episode of the live
Mhm.
action show. But I still felt like, as limited as it was with the animation and certainly with time constraints, because it was half the running time, less than half the running time, I still think they just absolutely knocked it out of the park. That is the crowning achievement of the animated series is Yesteryear. So, I mean, I know we already talked about, my least favorite episode of the animated series is the Practical Joker, but I'm wondering, like, what are like your three least favorite episodes of the animated series?
It's hard. It was very hard. The Practical Joker is definitely down at the bottom. I'm not a fan of the Infinite Vulcan.
Okay.
And there are a bunch, honestly, that I don't particularly like. And it's just some. I think that, again, it goes into sort of being disappointed, and there's so many things in the Infinite Vulcan where I'm like, wait, what is going on, and why do we have these plant creatures, and they're going to reinvade, and then we have this guy who's a giant, and then we make Spock a giant, and it's just like, I don't know what was going on. And for me, and I'm really sorry because I know you like this episode, but my least favorite episode of the animated series is the Magics of Megas
Oh,
2.
oh my gosh.
I
Why?
just I don't know. I think the animation is weak. I don't think the story makes sense. I think it's all over the place. I don't understand what they're trying to say or what they're trying to do. It's very, very confusing to me. So for me, that's the one where I just like, I
Well,
don't get
I get it. It's a weird episode. I think Magic of Megas 2 is a weird episode, but I think it's also a very ambitious episode because they did try to put a lot into that one. I'd forgotten that they left it kind of ambiguous at the end with, like, is Lucian really Lucifer, the devil? And I like that it was ambiguous, but
it. Hmm.
I also thought it was a pretty ambitious thing to go from, like, this thing is they're in the center of the galaxy, and then there's this being, and he's like, got incredible powers, and then suddenly they're, being held in for, on trial at the Salem witch trials. I'm like, wow. I mean, kind of felt like a third season episode of the original series to me. My bottom three, certainly Practical Joker. I said I don't like that one. I'm also, I hate to say it, I am not a fan of Mudd's Passion because I'm really just generally not a fan of Harry Mudd in general. I don't really care for I Mudd. I think it's, a little silly, and I, you know, just never really go other than like when I rewatched it for Enterprise Incidents. I It's not one I tend to rewatch very often. I like Mudd's women. I don't like I Mudd, but I like Mudd's women just because I like the music and I like the cinematography and I like the women. But in terms of another episode of the animated series, I'm not really crazy about. Another one that's a direct sequel to the original series. I don't care for More Tribbles, More Troubles because it is not different enough from the Trouble with
Yeah.
Tribbles. Yeah, yeah, sure, the troubles get bigger instead of just multiplying, but I still don't think it's different enough. And I don't think the humorous take that played so well in the live action version, I don't think that humor, and you pointed this out during a conversation, I don't think that worked as well in animated form.
Yeah, I agree with all that. It's really hard because and a lot of it goes to how are we adjusting our grading on a curve system? And in the original series, when we were having these conversations, there are so many home runs. You and I probably could have filled our top tens 3 times with episodes we absolutely love.
Uh,
And then there are a few just complete strikeouts, to continue my baseball metaphor.
yep.
Whereas with the animated series, it's like, well, there are a lot of singles, a couple of doubles. Whether or not you say yesteryear is a home run is a question, and then there's a lot of strikeouts or a lot of like maybe a base on balls or something. So it's like it makes this whole thing a lot harder. Well, and again, this brings us to our next question, which is let's count down our top five. So, what was your number five favorite episode of the animated series?
Well, continuing with that part of the conversation we just had, number five is The Magics of Megas 2 for reasons I already said. So, what is your number five?
I found this a really hard list to come up with, but I went with the Jihad because I like that it's a totally different kind of adventure from what we've had before, and I like that it's sort of teams up. It's like a team going on a mission. It's like Mission Impossible, where we have different people with different skills, and it took Kirk and Spock, who are the center of the adventure, like in the original series, but it put them with a different crowd trying to accomplish a different task.
Absolutely excellent point. My number four is One of Our Planets is Missing. I just think it's an episode I completely forgot about until I rewatched it, and I just thought, well, for one thing, it does bear a whole striking resemblance to Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which came 6 years
Right.
later. But I just thought there was a lot going on there, a lot of adventure, a lot of excitement, and again, a lot of just sort of that the challenge and the burden of command that Kirk grappled with, certainly in the first season
Right.
of the original series, with this colony and his connection to Bob Wesley because of the Ultimate Computer. And I just thought that was a superb episode of the animated series. What's number four on your list?
So first of all, that one was sort of my number six and kept coming on and off my list as I was trying to
Uh-huh.
figure this out. So I agree with all that. My number four is the ambergris element for the reasons I said before, Shatner's performance and some of the science fiction ideas and a nice build to the final climax of it. What is your number three?
My number three is the time trap. I just felt like the time trap was just a really well done, well executed, well paced, fun episode that tied so much of the animated show into everything that preceded it in the original series because of like all the aliens that were featured in this episode and this uneasy alliance with the Klingons, and they don't trust each other, and they're certainly Spock is right not to trust the Klingons, as we find out, but just sort of this idea of connecting the Enterprise to the Klingon ship and using both powers to get out of the trap. And I don't know if I brought this up during our conversation for the time trap. And in fact, I don't think we did, because we did that episode with Robert Klein, who was the storyboard artist. And I thought about it, but I didn't want to, like, go too off base and on too much of a tangent. But the time trap reminded me. Did you ever see the movie 2010?
I did, but I don't have a lot of memory of it.
Well, in that movie, the USS Discovery, the HAL 9000, connects with the Russian ship, the Alexei Leonov, to use the power of both ships to get away from Jupiter before Jupiter turns into a star. And the way they connect in the movie 2010, that movie came out in 1984, and the time trap was 1973. So I just thought, wow, that was a really interesting way to make me think of the animated series when I saw 2010. But I mean, overall, I just think it's a fun episode, and again, just like you going back to the time when the Klingons and the Federation were not friends. It felt like a really good, solid Star Trek episode. What about number three on your list?
Mine is one we've talked about a bit already, which is How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. Really good episode, and I think it does a lot of the things we like from Star Trek. Is it has these ideas about gods and about human civilization, stuff like that. We introduce a cool new character in Ensign Walking Bear, and we have the thing of us trying to solve this problem from two different positions, with Spock making smart decisions on board the Enterprise and Kirk actually being kind of physical and active as he jumps on the giant cat, whatever that thing is,
Yeah, yeah.
in order to save the day, and then has to talk to a god, which is I did really like that one.
Well, number two on my list is an episode that we talked about already, and keep in mind, this is my list of top five favorite episodes. So I'm going to preface this further by saying that for the original series, I can acknowledge that Sitting on the Edge of Forever is the best episode of the original
Mm,
series for many, many reasons. But I think you know what my favorite episode of the original series is.
I do. It's Metamorphosis.
And we could not let an episode of Enterprise Incidents go by one last time without mentioning Metamorphosis. So, my number two favorite
Wow.
episode of the animated series is Yesteryear. It's not my number one.
It is
But it is my
fantastic.
number 2 because I think it is, all the things we talked about. I just think it's a superb episode, one with a lot of emotion. The only episode that Dorothy Fontana, DC Fontana wrote, while she was, working with all the other scripts and all the other teleplays with all the other episodes from the first season. But, the emotion of it, seeing the Guardian again, and, the stakes, and, the butterfly effect of Spock kinda like, well, this didn't happen when I was here before. And Leonard Nimoy's vocal performance in the episode was very, very good. I think and William Simpson, Billy Simpson, as he was credited back then. This was his test, and they wound up using his test for the actual episode. I think it's really an emotional, powerful, long-lasting episode that is up there with some of the very best of the original series.
So my guess is that we might have the reversed number two and number one, because my number two is the counterclock incident. And so, but so let me just say, just to speak on what you said about yesteryear, I agree with all that, and I think that the biggest thing is like what yesteryear does that no episode of the animated series does like this, and it doesn't even. I don't think there's an episode of the original series that does this. We are going to a deep spotlight on a single character, and it is an entirely character oriented piece,
Mhm.
and that is something that later Star Trek is going to do in various episodes. But this one is really, it's like, this is just about Spock and his history and how he got to where he got to and examining his life. And so in that sense, you know what, I'm going to go with you on your, it's the Citizen Kane of the animated series. Sure. Why not? I think it's fantastic, but I think the counterclock incident, and I totally get why my guess is you put this at number one, is
Correct.
top to bottom feels like Star Trek, has references to Star Trek, has a great sense of adventure, has challenging ideas, has introduces great characters in Robert and Sarah April. Is a fantastic episode, top to bottom.
I couldn't have said it any better. Yes, that is my number one, and I think having our guest, Fred Bronson, who wrote the episode as John Culver, to join us for that final conversation on Counterclock. And after he was also a publicist for the show. And, like you talk about like someone who just loves Star Trek, who got to write an episode for it, like Howard Weinstein, who did The Pirates of Orion when he was 19 years old. Still to this day, I think the youngest writer Star Trek ever had. But Fred Bronson was a big fan. He was one of those protesters on NBC the night when they were trying to save Star Trek for third season, and he, knew Roddenberry, knew Fontana, wrote 2 episodes of Next Gen, and still watching Star Trek to this day and loving it. I think that really was an enlightening conversation, in addition to being a really wonderful conversation. But again, just the way that episode, whether intentional or not, brings brings Star Trek, just Star Trek. And that is the first 2 shows, the original show and the animated show. Again, take away, quote unquote, the original series, take away, quote unquote, the animated series. All of this stuff that ran from 66 to 69 and 1974, 73 through 75, all of that it's just Star Trek. And that we got to cover Star Trek in this way, complete. It is a complete arc on Enterprise incidents. I don't think anybody has done what we did here on Enterprise, and certainly tons of episode rewatches and deep dives and podcasts and write ups and so on and so on, and they're all great and they all bring their own perspectives. But for us to link it all, to connect the dots, to treat Star Trek, all of this from 66 to 75 as a complete series, as a complete arc, was extremely rewarding and deserving. And the animated series deserves to be mentioned and to be appreciated in the same breath as the live action show. And I think we did justice to both.
I think I agree with everything you said, and I feel it was an incredibly rewarding process for me. I think, am I ever going to put the animated series up at the same level with the original series? No, I'm not. Am I going to watch episodes of the animated series again in my life? Maybe a couple of them.
Yeah.
Most of them I'm never going to watch again.
Mm.
But as a person who loves history and as a person who is a completionist, like having it's like listening to, bootleg Beatles tapes or something like that, where it's like, is this at the level of the greatness? Would they be the greatest band of all time if it was just this is the only thing we're hearing? No, but as a person who wants to put together the entire picture of Star Trek that got us to where we got to, this was a great, great journey to go on. And it's like, and if a casual Star Trek fan or a person new to Star Trek said, hey, what are the first 10 things I should watch? None of them would be in the animated series. I wouldn't do that. But as a person with deep, profound love of Star Trek, I don't think your love can be complete unless you went through and watched the animated series and understood what was good about it, what was not good about it, how it contributed to the show, its place within the history of the show, and with the history of this whole universe that is now Star Trek is super, super important.
I agree completely. And I know, when we were doing the original show, and we were getting, toward the end of the third season, I know, you and I had conversations separately off camera, like, should we do the animated series or should we just, wrap it up with the original series and just like that's it? And we move forward. And again, I'm really, really glad I did, because I know that there were a couple episodes that were tough to get through. And I know that I think I probably overall, again, because of the whole grading on a curve thing, like the animated series maybe a little more than you do. But again, I think that it's worthy of analysis and appreciation. And again, to be able to do that in the exact 50th anniversary year of it, 2023, it was made it so deserving. And again, just so many great guests who have joined us, like Fred Bronson and Robert Klein and William Simpson, and Alan Dean Foster joined us twice, and Howard Weinstein was a wonderful guest. Of course, our great friend Johnny Roca, for Serpent's Tooth conversation, that was excellent. Probably one of the best conversations we had about the animated series. And with that, that brings us to the end of this phase of Enterprise incidents because, you and I started, we, really just wanted to do the original series. We extended that to the animated series. And now we have covered basically 101 episodes, well, 102 really, of Star Trek. Because if you include the cage, that means there were 102 produced episodes of Star Trek up until the animated series was finished.
And this brings us to the big question everyone has been asking us: what's next for Enterprise Incidents? Where are we going? And the fact is, this has been a really difficult conversation for Scott and I, and difficult choices have been made. And I have to say, where I am with it, which is that I wanted to do the original series. I wanted to give the honor to these characters that I absolutely adore. And this has been one of the great artistic projects of my life. And the reality is, I am ready to move on, but I don't want Enterprise Incidents to move on. I want Enterprise Incidents to keep going so I can be a fan and an occasional guest. But the reality is, in my life, I have projects that I want to do that are passion projects of mine, and I need to make decisions. And this has been one of the hardest decisions for me to make, which is to leave the show. And the big conversation I've had with Scott is I want to do everything in my power to have Scott's vision of Enterprise Incidents move forward, because me, as a fan of his and of a fan of Star Trek, I want to move into the next generation. And I'm really, really hoping that Scott is able to do just that.
Well, first of all, I got to say that we wouldn't have even done Enterprise Incidents at all, and I've talked about this before, unless Steve pursued me over the course of a couple years while I was doing his other show, the Cinephiles, and and it just was the right time, the right thing to do, and certainly I agree 100% with you, Steve. I mean, this has definitely been this whole journey of you and me doing this over the last 2.5 years. When we started this, we were just at a time when like the vaccinations were being made available, so we were still kind of in a really difficult situation where creatively and emotionally, Enterprise Incidents just gave me something really to look forward to every week. And to be able to take something that I've loved since I was 6 years old and to see it in a completely different way with a fresh set of eyes, and to have our enterprisers, our fans, our listeners had the same sort of feeling that we were making them see the original series in a whole new way, that was extremely rewarding. When I'm out and about, certainly when I'm going to the Star Trek convention in Las Vegas, or I'm in San Diego Comic Con, or when I went to the Star Trek set tour in Ticonderoga, to have people come up to me and say, I'm a big fan of Enterprise Incidents. I love what you and Steve did with the show and the way that you tied everything together. That was so, so, so rewarding. But even I got to a point where I felt like, maybe we should wrap it up with the animated series and just like close the book, put it on a shelf, and it's there anytime we want to go back and listen to one of our episodes. But I do love The Next Generation. And I've been rewatching The Next Generation for the last few months. And I do want to move forward with The Next Generation. So the answer is yes. Enterprise Incidents will continue in some form, hopefully under the name Enterprise Incidents. It might have to be changed if I move to another platform. I don't know. I just have to wait and see. But what it really comes down to is that I need to find another co pilot who is going to be as good as the great Steve Morris. And until that happens, I might just have to wait a bit before moving forward onto the next generation. But in the meantime, I will continue with Enterprise Incidents, maybe going back and doing some interviews with some of the guest stars I didn't get for early in the first season of the original show, actors who are still with us that I just even think about to approach, who I know because I've seen them at conventions. So I can continue with that. Maybe I'll continue with some interviews from some of the other shows. So from time to time, you will see me or certainly hear me post new content under Enterprise Incidents, some interviews that I had not been able to do before. And eventually, when it gets to the point when I find a co-host, a co-pilot, a co-producer, and a great editor who really loves Next Generation, knows a lot about Next Generation, maybe brings another perspective to it. But I absolutely positively will eventually move forward when the time is right. So for all the enterprisers who've been with us since the very beginning and with us for the original series and the animated series, doing some of the movies, which were over on the Cinephiles, which we are going to do. We are going to do the movies we didn't get to. And Steve will talk a little bit about that. But so the bottom line is Enterprise Incidents will continue. I'm going to post new content from time to time. I have to find a new co-host, and either it'll continue as Enterprise Incidents The Next Generation, or it might be under a different name. But when the time is right, I will be doing deep dives into The Next Generation. So if you know of anybody, hit me up and let me know.
Well, I bet you're going to get a lot of offers at this point because there are a lot of Star Trek fans out there, in particular, a lot of Next Generation fans. Well, I mean, I, for one, like I said, as a fan, I'm super excited to see the things you're going to do. And you had mentioned something to me that I am super excited about, which is the era between the end of the animated series and the motion picture that involves Star Trek Phase 2 and all the different plans and attempts to relaunch Star Trek, and that you might have some people to interview to discuss that era. I'd be super excited about that.
See, I am. That's yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, and thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, that's something I really want to explore because at a time when we saw hardly any content at all from Star Trek outside of like new novels, and stuff like that. I think that the mid to late '70s period where they were trying to figure out what to do next with Star Trek is really, really interesting and fascinating. So I'm going to try to find people to interview about that, and of course, I'll post it right here on Enterprise Incidents.
Well, and as you mentioned, Scott, we have done, strangely enough, on the Cinephiles, the Star Trek films in this order. We did Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan first. We did Star Trek the Motion Picture second, and then we skipped 3, 4, and 5 to do Star Trek 6 third, which means that we have not done Star Treks 3, 4, and 5, which we plan on doing at the Cinephiles. Not exactly sure what the schedule is going to be, but we're going to do them, of course, with Scott, and they will be released on the Enterprise Incidents feeds. And then we've talked about doing Star Trek 2009 and even doing Galaxy Quest. And I would love to do all of those. They're not going to happen immediately because we're doing other things on the Cinephiles. And so we can't devote the next 3 months just to Star Trek on the Cinephiles. That's not how that show works. But we are going to do it over time. And so, the fact is, Scott and I are going to continue to talk. This is not the end of the relationship. It is me not moving forward as your partner on Enterprise Incidents, but we're still going to have lots of Star Trek and movies to talk about in the future.
Absolutely. We absolutely will. And in the meantime, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Movie Mance. And now that this is the 50th anniversary of the animated series, please do share Enterprise Incidents. We have every episode of the animated series. Please share them on your social media platforms so people who maybe also have overlooked the animated series, maybe this will be their way to look back at it and watch the animated episode and then listen to our podcast covering that episode. And of course, if you have not listened to all 80 episodes of the original series, well, you got a whole lot of catching up to do because they are all there. And again, please share Enterprise Incidents for people who have not yet found Enterprise Incidents so they can discover what we did with this first phase of Star Trek and help them see Star Trek in a whole new way. It's all there. You can listen to it as many times as you want. And I'm curious, have you listened to Star Trek and Enterprise Incidents a few times? There are episodes that you listen to over and over. I'd be curious to hear that.
Well, and we'd love to hear all of your thoughts on social media. You can visit us on our Facebook page. And, Scott and I answered a bunch of questions in the course of this episode. We'd love to hear your answers to some of these questions. For instance, what is your top 5 episodes of the animated series? What were your favorite moments, favorite guest stars? Those are the things we'd love to see you share with us on social media through our Facebook page or Enter Incidents on Twitter, Enterprise Incidents on Instagram. And as we said, Enterprise Incidents is changing, but it is moving forward. So it's still a good time to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on YouTube, on Stitcher, on Google. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, how about a celebratory 5-star review for all the work we've put in the last 2.5 years creating the show for you? That would be very, very appreciated. And if you want to reach me, you can do it at SR Morris on Twitter, SR Morris1 on Instagram, and of course, the Cinephiles, which has been going now for 7 years, doing serious, serious deep dives into the greatest films ever made.
Well, this brings us to a close of phase one of Enterprise Incidents with Scott and Steve. And I am supremely proud of everything that we have accomplished over the last 2.5 years, covering 102 episodes of Star Trek. Enterprise Incidents will continue. So until the next episode of Enterprise Incidents, whatever form that's going to be, you know the drill. Keep going boldly, and the human adventure is just beginning.